Good evening, everyone. I'm Father Ralph Strome, priest associate here at Redeemer, and on behalf of Director Father Charleston Wilson, who could not be here this evening, the other members of the clergy corps, the wardens, vestry, and congregation of this Christian community, I welcome you. We're glad you're here. Tonight's program, Eyewitness to Dachau, is hosted by Books and Beyond, the men's book club here at Redeemer, and John will be speaking right after me. It's an honor for the church to host such a program, and to welcome Chuck Palmeri and his publisher, and might I say, longtime member of Redeemer, Liz Coursen. Let us pray. Almighty God, we offer thanks for the opportunity tonight to be reminded of a very dark time and place in the 20th century, Dachau. We also thank you for the life and witness of Chuck. Through this program, may all of us be reminded of the human propensity to commit evil and of the capability of human beings to commit evil in unspeakable ways. Help us also, we pray, to be vigilant and to oppose those who would denigrate any person or group of people. Help us to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. Amen. Again, welcome.
Thank you, Father Strome. Good evening. My name is John Mathis, and I'm appearing before you tonight as the representative of the book group of the Men of Redeemer, Books and Beyond, which Father Strome indicated we were helping to sponsor the program tonight. I want to thank, in addition to Father Strome and, of course, Father Charleston Wilson, special thanks to Father Chris Wood and the staff of Redeemer who have approved and supported the presentation of this special program in this sacred space. I'm quoting now. In the summer of 1944, 18-year-old aspiring seminarian Chuck Palmeri, eldest son of a first-generation Italian family in Buffalo, enlists in the U.S. Army. As a new member of the 42nd Infantry Rainbow Division, Chuck and his squad fight their way through Germany, facing last-gasp opposition from fanatical Nazi troops, fiercely determined to avoid the dishonor of defeat. And then, in the waning days of the war, Chuck witnesses the stunning horror of Dachau, the infamous German concentration camp shortly after its liberation. I was reading, ladies and gentlemen, from the back of Chuck's award-winning book, Boy, Soldier, Recollections of World War II. It's a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it. About a month ago, we celebrated Veterans Day, and 3 days ago, we observed the solemn anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day. So it's only appropriate that we pause in this season of reflection to hear firsthand the story of a teenage soldier's experience at Dachau, one of the lowest points in the history of Western civilization. Chuck and his publisher, Liz Coursen, have teamed up to present this program about the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. Liz is a noted author and publicist who, as Father Strome indicated, also happens to be a member of Redeemer. She will discuss the history of Dachau itself, up to the events leading to the liberation of the camp, and then Chuck will tell the story about what he saw at Dachau, what he thought about what he saw, and how Dachau has affected his life. Please help me welcome Chuck Palmeri and Liz Coursen.
Good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to be here. I am a longtime member of Church of the Redeemer. I believe I started attending Redeemer in 7th grade, and I'm not going to do the math for you on that, but It's been a while. As a matter of fact, those of you who are Redeemerites, I can say that Ann Stevenson Moe, who recently retired, was brand new on the staff when I began to attend. And before I do get started, I'm going to echo, and I'm sorry to be repetitive, but I do want to thank several people. And first of all, I'd really like to thank Father Chris Wood. Father Wood's grandfather fought in the European theater during World War II, and he is so sorry that he could not be here to join us this evening. I'd like to thank John Mathis of the Redeemer Book Club for hosting the event. I'd like to thank Father Strome for officiating here. And Jim, if you could wave a little bit. Jim is our Rambo, our tech guy in the back who is working all of the technological things that really make a program. So Jim, I can't tell you how grateful I am for you being here. And last but not least, Larry Brown, who is our usher this evening. Larry, would you wave to the folks so everyone can see you? Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for Redeemer. I don't know if you know this, but we have been attending services here in Redeemer for months now, and there is a team of Redeemer people who come through every time a service concludes and make sure that the church is as clean and safe as it possibly can be. Not only what you see, but also we have new air handlers. Everything that can be done has been done to ensure the safety of the Redeemer community, and I am very grateful. This evening, we have a three-part program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Dachau. I'd like everyone to be grounded in the context of Dachau, in the context of not just its role in German extermination of primarily Jews and undesirable people. And then I'm going to let Chuck talk. I want you to hear from an eyewitness about what he actually saw at the concentration camp days after its liberation. And then Chuck and I are going to talk a little bit about book publishing, because it's my hope that I know that it's unlikely you have a story about Dachau, but everyone in here has a story. And it's our hope that we not only inspire people to write down their stories, but more than that, I'm hoping to motivate some of you to actually sit down and tell your story. So I'd like to get started by talking a little bit about Dachau. Dachau is actually 4 different things. Dachau is a village that's about 9 miles to the northwest of the city of Munich. And Dachau, for generations, was known as a mecca for artists, attracting artists from all over the world, and for a time it was actually called the Greenwich Village of Europe. And there was a school of art that came from the Dachau experience. And they practiced the plein air method of painting. And so you saw people out in the countryside painting the bucolic scenes of Dachau and its environs. So the marshes, the river, the fields, the streams, the cows in the pastures. And Dachau is actually, Dachau art is a real thing. In fact, in 2009, Oglethorpe University hosted a large exhibit titled Dachau Before Dachau, filled with Dachau art. And Dachau art, if it can be actually authenticated, commands a premium in the international art market today. In 1933, Heinrich Himmler, who has been called the architect of the Holocaust, was the chief of police in Munich. And in Munich, they had set aside the prison to incarcerate political prisoners. Well, the prison quickly overfilled, and the SS actually co-opted a former munitions plant outside of Dachau, about 1.5 miles away from the village itself, and created the first concentration camp in Germany. And the initial focus was not Jews necessarily, it was for political prisoners, which meant social democrats, which meant members of the Communist Party, which meant undesirables like homosexuals, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. And it was limited to 5,000 people, and it quickly maxed out its space. And Heinrich Himmler was then a lowly SS man, but a real adherent, a real believer in Nazism, and he rose to great heights in the Hitler hierarchy. I said that Dachau, actually, there are 4 Dachaus. There's the village of Dachau, then there's the Dachau compound. And the Dachau compound itself was composed of 2 parts. There was the concentration camp, and the concentration camp, this is actually an architectural rendering of the compound. The concentration camp area was this rectangular area here, and contiguous to the concentration camp, but separated quite strenuously, was this large SS compound right here, separated by the Worms River, which eventually went out into the Amper River. It was also separated by not just this big moat with raised sides on either side, it was separated by electrified barbed wire, and on the concentration camp side, it was also manned with guard towers with machine guns. So even though these 2 spaces had this adjacent property line, for all intents and purposes, the administration of both locations was entirely separate. But there was also a 4th component of Dachau. There were more than 100 named subcamps of Dachau that housed prisoners. And so if someone actually says that he liberated Dachau, you have to actually ask him which Dachau he's talking about, because there were all these 100 named camps, the subcamps. So it can get kind of confusing when you start to look at it. Now, as the war was winding down, elements of the 45th, the 42nd, and the 3rd were all moving to the east, and everyone was beginning to merge into Munich. They were trying to prevent the German army from breaking out and getting into the mountains, where it was feared that the Germans would regroup, recoup, and continue to fight. So these elements of the US Army and the Allies were converging towards Munich, and they were doing it so fast that they had literally run out of the maps. And even though they knew that the Dachau concentration camp was somewhere near the village of Dachau, they weren't exactly sure where. Now, the 45th was to the north, the 42nd was in the middle, and the 3rd was to the south. And they were moving almost simultaneously towards Munich. And on the morning of April 29th, 1945, elements of the 45th got to Dachau first, but they engaged the SS compound. And while they were fighting the SS, who did not apparently realize that the Americans were knocking at their door, the 42nd, under the command of Lieutenant General Henning Linden, rolled right up to the front gates of the Dachau concentration camp in 5 jeeps. And the general was accompanied by 3 accredited photographers from international newspapers, as well as a number of reporters and other soldiers. And they were able to come right to the camp gates because they had met with 2 escaped French POWs, and the POWs directed them right to the gates. So while the 45th was fighting the SS in the SS compound, Brigadier General, these are lots of different titles, the Brigadier General and his company were met by the commandant of the concentration camp, as well as an official of the Swiss Red Cross. And Brigadier General Linden accepted the surrender of the concentration camp. Now, shortly thereafter, the 45th arrived, and there was some confusion about who was who and who was doing what, but not all that much confusion. So as the 42nd arrived at Dachau, they were met with a horrific sight. There were 32,000 emaciated, starved, ill prisoners inside a concentration camp that was originally designed for 5,000 people. Not only that, because the SS had run out of fuel about a week or so before the end of the war, before the 42nd Infantry arrived, no bodies had been incinerated. So the bodies had literally begun to pile up. And there were between 4,000 to 6,000 corpses above ground when the 42nd arrived at the camp. And I want to read this to you because as Americans, we need to remember how high a regard that many people consider us. Because this was the official report of the U.S. 7th Army about the liberation of Dachau. And in the upper right, you'll see a very small photo of some of the newly freed prisoners. But here's what the official report read. Sunday, just after the noon meal, the air was unusually still. The big field outside the compound was deserted. Suddenly, someone began running toward the gate at the other side of the field. Others followed. The word was shouted through the mass of gray, tired prisoners. Americans! That word repeated, yelled over the shoulders in throaty Polish, in Italian, in Russian, and Dutch, and in the familiar ring of French. The first internee was shot down as he rushed toward the gate by the guard. Yet they kept running and shouting through eager lips and unbelieving eyes, Americans. And here are some photos of the very relieved, newly freed Dachau prisoners. And if you look at this photo on the upper left, this is the moat that separated the SS compound, which would have been to our far left. And here are some of the barracks, and here are some of the prisoners, more prisoners here, and then two contemporaneous photos of prisoners who had been freed. Now, one thing that both the 45th and the 42nd were confronted with as they approached the gates of Dachau was something that's become known as the death train. And the death train was a 40 to 45 car train that had left Buchenwald 3 weeks earlier. At the end of the war, the Nazis were desperate to not only evade the advancing Allied troops, they were desperate that the world not know what had happened in the concentration camps. So as the Allies were approaching, there was a huge movement in these concentration camps to get the prisoners away and as far away as possible. So this train left Buchenwald on April 7th, and it meandered through the German countryside for 3 weeks. There was a brief interlude in Czechoslovakia, and then it went back into Germany, stopping only one time. It stopped one time. 900 people were forcibly detrained and massacred by the Nazis. Cars were decoupled, and the train continued. Even not just barely a week before VE Day, the Nazis were still intent on killing as many of these internees as possible. In fact, there had been orders which were ignored at Dachau to massacre the entire population of the concentration camp. And as I say, they were not followed. But here is a view of the corpses in the train. I did not want to belabor the photos and the images. I know we've all seen them before. But there were 2,300, some odd 2,300 people in these trains as they approached Dachau. And believe it or not, after 3 weeks, no food, no water, no fresh air, no sanitary facilities. There were people alive in the trains when the trains arrived at Dachau. And the Nazis brought in machine guns, machine gunned down the trains to make sure there were no living eyewitnesses to what had happened. But there was one man still alive. As the 42nd approached this death train, and the men are walking past these corpses, one of the men saw a pale hand reaching out from the tangled corpses. He yelled to his superior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Downard. The lieutenant colonel came running over, leaped into the train car, and pulled an emaciated young Polish man from the corpses. And I want to tell the story because, to me, this is a testimony to the strength of the human spirit. The young man who had not eaten, had anything to drink, he was naked, he looked up to his American liberator and he had one question. One thing, near death, was uppermost in his mind. He looked up and he asked, "Am I free?" am I free? And the lieutenant colonel looked down at him and said, son, the Americans are here. And yes, you are free. And interestingly enough, no one knows what happened to this young man. His name and his fate remain absolutely unknown. But what is sure is that he knew who had liberated him at the very end. Now, one of the things that was really interesting to me as an editor and a publisher, I do an enormous amount of fact checking, enormous amount. And I found myself totally enthralled by Chuck's story and the story of World War II, which I didn't really know too much about before I began to work with Chuck. And one of the things that really surprised me as I began to accumulate what turned out to be almost a 500-item library about Dachau, about World War II. I've collected photographs, postcards, all sorts of ephemera, there was actually an alternate narrative about the official liberation of the concentration camp. And this particular alternate universe narrative was promulgated by the commander of the 45th, who many years after the liberation began to publish a very different account from what is the official story, and making himself the hero of this adventure. And I didn't realize it right away, but I got a hold of a couple books, and all of a sudden I started thinking, hey, this isn't what I've been reading. Well, I got a hold of his book, his pamphlet, and I began to read it, and I thought, wait a minute, I've heard this story before. This is very familiar to me. Well, it turned out that I had read and been a big fan of Leon Uris's novel, his bestseller, came out in 1963, Armageddon. Has anyone in here read Armageddon? I'm a big fan. No? John's read Armageddon. It is a fantastic book, but turns out to be what I didn't really anticipate. It's a work of fiction, because Mr. Uris and his team lifted this narrative by this guy from the 45th in its entirety and plopped it right into his book Armageddon. And then, to make matters worse, this story continues to have traction, because as recently as 2013, The Liberator came out by Alex Kershaw, and it has a glowing report on the cover by no less than the Wall Street Journal about this book. Now, after you've been researching a while, the first thing you do when you get a new book is you flip to the bibliography, because you want to know what the sources are that people are using. So I got The Liberator, and I flipped to the back, and I thought, okay, this is great. And then he quotes the man from the 45th extensively. And here's the funny thing, that the source of the quotes turn out to be the man himself. So this gentleman from the 45th has concocted the story. It has gained traction over the decades, but here's the gold standard. If you want to read something about the day of the liberation, is Surrender of the Dachau concentration camp, written by Colonel John H. Linden. He is the son of the brigadier general who actually liberated the concentration camp. He's got photos, he's got documentation, he's got a minute-by-minute timeline of all the players. And interestingly, one of the players, you might recognize her name, Marguerite Higgins. Ms. Higgins was a war correspondent, an accredited war correspondent in not just the European theater during World War II, she was also a war correspondent in Korea and Vietnam as well, and she played quite a role in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. But it was very interesting, a kind of side note about the kind of research that you do when you're going to be publishing a book. But we don't have to actually speculate what it was like at Dachau, because we have Mr. Palmeri here who is going to tell us about what he saw. And here's the thing, 2 or 3 days after the liberation, that's when Chuck got there, but he saw everything. And he saw everything because General Dwight D. Eisenhower had decreed that all the bodies that were above ground at Dachau would remain above ground for a week, so that the Allied forces who were in the area, the Americans, the French, the British, could cycle through the camp, to be eyewitnesses to the evil that had been committed at the concentration camp. So Chuck.
Yes.
I want to start at the beginning. I want to start in Buffalo. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your family, your parents, your grandparents, your family. What was it like?
Should I stand?
No, you sit down. You stay seated, please.
Well, when I was a boy, when I was born, my mother was 16 years old. And I didn't have another brother until I was 9 years old. And then, after I came home from the service, we had 3 more children. And one of my sisters, who was 23 years younger than I am, said to me one day, you know, we don't know anything about what you did when you were in the service, and I don't know anything about our grandparents. Why don't you write something that we can all read? And so I wrote a biography of our family, and I sent copies to all my cousins and nephews and nieces and my own children, because I believe that it's important that these young people understand what happened while we were in the service, what happened to me, and what happened at Dachau. At any rate, my sister then called me and said, well, I enjoyed your book. That's the autobiography, the biography. I enjoyed that, but you didn't say very much about your service time, and we want to know about that. And that's how I started to write the book. So I wrote pages and pages of little items that happened while I was in the service. And going back to the family.
Well, your dad was from Sicily, first generation.
My father was born in Sicily. He came here when he was 5 years old. My mother was born here. And I have to say that, can you imagine my grandmother, who was then 21 or 22 years old, with 3 little kids, coming to the United States. She didn't know the language. She had no money. She had nothing until she reached New York. What a scary thing. She must have been scared to death. But she ended up being the pillar of the family. Grandma Margaret was the woman that made us all true Americans. She assisted, and when I joined the service, my grandmother insisted to tell me that I would be okay because she was going to pray for me, and I'm sure she did, and I was okay. Then I enjoyed living in Buffalo. I had lots of friends, and I was an altar boy, and as a result of being an altar boy, I met some really nice priests that I liked. And they didn't talk me into it, but I decided I liked these guys, and I think maybe I'd like to be a priest too. So in high school, I went to the seminary. In my senior year at the seminary, I decided that I couldn't be a priest. Fortunately, I like pretty girls too much. And in addition to that, there was a feeling among young men, 18 years old, who wanted to get into the battle, who had a patriotic feeling, and they joined, not knowing what they knew it was going to be dangerous, but they joined, and we joined, and ended up in the Army, training in the United States. And on the 1st of January, got on a boat in Boston and headed for France. We had 2 weeks, 15 days of absolute terrible seasickness. It was the worst time of my life. And I wasn't the only one. When we got to France, came into Le Havre, and in a short time, they took us up to the front lines.
I I think you said that it took 2 days in a train car to get to the front line?
Yes, we traveled in very nice accommodations in what they call the 40 and 8s, which 40 and 8 men and 8 horses, which is a freight car with wood siding, and that's what we traveled in to the front lines. And as we got close to the front lines, we passed the first big artillery guns that were shooting to Germany. And when we heard those blasts, we knew that we were at the war, and we were at the front lines. Well, the front lines for us were foxholes on the side of a mountain, and across on the other side of that valley were the Germans. They couldn't see us, we couldn't see them because of heavy foliage. The very first night, I was in a foxhole, and I had a companion, one of the seniors, veterans, to stay with me. But then he had to go on a patrol. So I spent my first night on the front lines alone in a foxhole. And I was scared to death because you could hear the guns shooting here and there. And I was warned by Lieutenant Maniello, who was our platoon sergeant, platoon leader. And he warned us that if we heard anybody come up the hill and say, help me, I'm hurt, to ignore him completely, because the Germans do that, to draw you out of the hole. He said, don't leave your foxhole, don't shoot at them, don't say a word, just let it go. But can you imagine listening to a man yelling, screaming, I'm hurt, come and help me, and you had to ignore him? That's the way it was. Anyway, after the night, 3 or 4 weeks in the foxhole, we decided, the generals decided that we should go forward and into the German lines, across the 6 V line, and eventually we went to many cities, Würzburg, Schweinfurt. In each places we had a battle, and in each place we had men that were killed. And while it was very close, I was never injured, and I kept thanking my grandmother. There's no question in my mind what I saw happen all around me, and the men being shot right next to me, that my guardian angel was protecting me. There's no question in my mind about that at all.
Chuck, tell our audience about Lieutenant Maniello and what happened.
About what?
Lieutenant Maniello and his
Yes.
rifle.
The first night I was in the foxhole, this Lieutenant Maniello was just he got a battlefield commission. He came and told me, gave me the information about not paying attention to anybody calling, just stay in the foxhole. Next morning, I learned that Lieutenant Maniello, who had gone on the patrol with my partner, was killed. He was killed by a mine. Here, not even 24 hours on the front line, and somebody I had just met is dead. I can tell you, I cried. Because he was just a young man, he was a boy, 21 years old. And he had given me, before he left, his little Italian dictionary. Being an Italian boy himself, he planned when the war was over to go to Italy, and he was working on his vocabulary. But he gave me his little dictionary and asked me to take care of it while he was gone. I still have the dictionary, and we have pictures of it, and I have the dictionary from Lieutenant Maniello. We tried to find his parents in Brooklyn and I didn't do that right away, I'm sorry to say, to get the book back to them, but I never able to find the family.
How much information did you, as a young soldier, get from the upper echelons? Did you have a feel for the prosecution of the war? Did you know what the strategy was, or?
No, the only thing that we privates and PFCs knew was where we were going the next day, what town we might be going to, and what we were going to do there. And this went on through the end of the war. We knew nothing about that we were going to be in Munich or Würzburg. Had no idea of the concentration camp, and I don't think even the generals knew about the concentration camps until the day we got there. Nonetheless, we did what we were told to do at any particular time, and that we were going into such and such a town, but we never had a new part of the whole plan. Okay.
So you had gone to Munich. You were the part of the liberating force, the 42nd, into Munich, and you had been there on duty a couple days.
I think one of the most interesting stories I can tell is that there's a young fellow named Wolfgang Rubinow who had been born in Germany and lived there, and when he was 10 or 12 years old, his father told him and his brother that they had to come to the United States because they had a Jewish grandmother, and the father knew that was going to be trouble for the family, so he sent the boys to the United States. Rubinow finally became a member of the 42nd Division and was in the intelligence group with us. We got to the city of Munich. Munich had been damaged by bombs, but now we were prepared to go in and tear the city apart. And this bothered him. And speaking perfect German, after getting permission from our general, he got on a jeep and drove into Munich and sought out the Bürgermeister, who's the mayor. And he said to him, listen, we're ready to bomb the devil out of Munich. All these beautiful museums and churches are going to be devastated. And the war is almost over. Why don't you surrender? And so, obviously speaking as a German boy, he spoke perfect German. And together they went to see the commanding officer of the German forces. And Rubinow got a surrender of the city of Munich. And so the only major city in Germany that was completely devastated by a ground battle, thanks to Mr. Rubinow, Sergeant Rubinow.
So you were in Munich, and then one day you heard the word Dachau. Can you tell us what you heard, who said what was said?
I was on guard in Munich, guarding the Volkssturm headquarters at the time. And one of our sergeants had gone on a trip and came back and told us about this terrible camp that he had been at, called the concentration camp at Dachau. And he described bodies laying around and piled up, and people, men in boxcars, and he told us the whole story. I didn't believe him. I thought he was exaggerating. What he said wasn't possible. And then, a few days later, my curiosity got the best of us. So some of us got in a Jeep and drove 15 miles out to Dachau. First we went through the little city of Dachau, which is a pretty little town, as was described to you here. The people of Dachau really wish that camp was not associated with their city. But at any rate, after we went through the city of Dachau, we came to the camp. the first thing we noticed as we got close, or as we were parking the Jeep, was a horrible, horrible odor. Just unbelievable, man. You coughed, you couldn't breathe. It was terrible. And then we got out of the Jeeps and went into the camp, and there were bodies laying all over. But the most impressive one, you saw the picture here, of bodies who were waiting to be cremated, were stacked 10 or 12 feet high. Men, women, their clothes gone, even some children dead. And it was absolutely nauseated. And then a little later, we went by the railroad cars that had come from Buchenwald. And the men and the doors were ajar now. But you could see inside 30 or 40 men. I don't think I saw any women, they're all men. They were fully clothed, all dead. And one of the German guards told us that just the day before we arrived, the SS set up machine guns and fired into those cars to kill anyone that might still be alive. Most of them, of course, were dead because they were starving, had no water, no facilities at all. Most of them had died in the train. But just in case anybody was still alive, they shot through the wooden side of these railroad cars and killed anybody. And as you saw the picture here, one man was alive. Of all of that, all those 30 or 40 railroad cars, one man alive. So when we continued walking through the camp, I saw bodies laying around, and then finally it got to me to the point where I was more concerned about the prisoners who were still alive, the ones that were dead. Seems like a callous, so they're gone, they're dead now. How about these poor guys that are walking around in their striped uniforms and their legs like little sticks, walking around, and surprisingly, not surprisingly, many died after the liberation because of malnutrition and just being sick, tuberculosis and other diseases. It was so horrible. And particularly when I saw the inside of the railroad cars with these guys stacked up who had died, I got so sick that I threw up. I couldn't take it anymore. I was probably in the camp a couple of hours. That's the most I could take. And I went out and sat in the Jeep and waited for the other fellows to come back out. Not surprisingly, as we drove back, we didn't say a word about what we saw. We didn't talk to each other. We just were numb. We couldn't believe it. As Churchill once said, that the atrocity of the concentration camps was the greatest crime ever permitted or ever done in the world. And then it was. 6 million Jews killed. And why? What did they do? They were Jewish. Over 12 million people were killed, some of them soldiers, some of them people that were opposed to Hitler, but the Jews were killed only because they were Jewish. It was absolutely horrible.
So you were actually one of the first Holocaust deniers because you did not believe what you heard and you had to go see it for yourself, and you did.
Yeah.
And it changed everything.
Yes, well, the boys that had gone earlier said that they didn't know how many Jews were or anything. We found that out later.
Mm-hmm.
But there were Jews in camp, and they killed them as soon as they could. And I went back in 1995, and they had set up a museum with the pictures. And one picture was a guard, and had a little girl by the hand, and as I was watching them walk, seemed getting ready to walk to somewhere, I heard a voice of a young girl who was watching this. And she says, my God, this German girl couldn't believe what she saw at the camp. Days later, the commanding general insisted that every citizen of Dachau go through the camp. And just a lot of them refused to go, but they forced them to go. They had to go to see this themselves. The other thing is that General Patton called Old Blood and Guts. When he got to Dachau, he threw up. He couldn't take it either. Yes. And he insisted, whatever camp that he was involved with, that the German nationals and citizens were the ones that did the burying of the dead and caring for the bed for the dead. And I have to tell you two little stories that are very important. Someday after I was at the camp, I was back at my post in Munich, and along came a platoon size, like 30 or 40 German soldiers, now our prisoners. And with them, an MP guard of ours in the front and the back, and also coming along were two former Dachau prisoners in their striped uniforms. And they stopped in front of my station. And I said to them, who are these guys? He said, these are the guards at Dachau who, endangering their own lives, smuggled medicine and food and clothing and blankets to the prisoners. That's the rest of the story. That didn't change my attitude about the Germans that fired into the cars and killed people. It didn't change my attitude about Germany, the enemy. But you have to know that there were some Germans who were careful and wanted to help people.
It was interesting too, working with Chuck, because I knew as an editor that this must have been a horrific story to revisit, a difficult story to tell, and yet I had this responsibility to the book, to the audience, to make sure that whatever Chuck wanted to say was said. And so I felt like we were at that place. And then about a week later, Chuck called me and said, hey, I have one more thing to add. And I'm thinking, wow, I thought I really plowed the field, but there's one more thing to add, and whatever it is, we're going to put it in. And Chuck added the part about throwing up after seeing Dachau, because I had given him a couple books about World War II, which included the account of Patton throwing up. And when you said that when you read that Old Blood and Guts Patton admitted to vomiting after seeing Dachau, it gave you license for I think the first time, or close to it, to admit that you had had the same experience.
You know, I have to say something that most of the soldiers who came home did not talk about their wartime. They kept it to themselves. They didn't come back and tell their mothers and fathers that they had been in the war and shot guns and were almost out. They didn't say anything. They were just glad to have it over with. And I said earlier, another story to tell you. We went back in 1995, the 50th anniversary. The 42nd Division was invited back to Dachau, and we were treated royally by the people of Dachau and the people of Munich for our saving their city of Munich and for helping out at the Dachau concentration camp. And the mayor of Dachau told us this story. When the prisoners were coming from other camps to Dachau, some of them came in the railroad cars where they were killed. Some of them came in trucks, and some walked. And the ones that were walking were guarded, and they were treated horribly. And the people in Dachau were very upset about the way they were treating these people. And they talked to the mayor at that time and other people and said, "Can we talk to the commandeer, the SS commander about this?" So they said, "Sure." Well, so we went to the SS commander and said, "The people in Dachau would like to talk to you about the inhuman handling of these people that are walking through our street." And the commander said, "Well, why don't you get 5 or 6 of those people and meet with me and we'll talk it over." So he did. He brought 5 or 6 people back to them. And he lined them up against the wall and shot them all. And the wall across from the city hall in Dachau are the bullet marks in the wall. And the mayor said those will stay there forever. We will not fix that wall up. If you come back in 10 years, you'll see them still there to remind us of what went on in Dachau.
So early on, Hitler was rounding up political prisoners. He was rounding up people who had any complaints, and even at the lowest level, at the little villages, the village leaders who protested the treatment of people who were being rounded up were all shot. So very early on, the road was clear for the Hitler agenda. And you went back 50 years later. How was it different? What was your perception?
Well, when we went back later, first I had a museum set up in the town hall of Dachau, and also in the Dachau camp itself. And all the barracks had been taken down, except one was left up to show the conditions that they had. But all the other barracks were torn down. And on Sunday morning, they had a mass, and for Catholic mass, and a Protestant service, and a Jewish service at 3 different locations in the rain with umbrellas, all of us out there. And listen to the talks of people who had been there earlier, young soldiers, old generals had come back and talked to us, and I sent you a copy of the talk. It renewed the memories of what had happened there. And
Was that the trigger when you started to really get out in the community and start to talk and share your experiences?
yes, that day there was a young fella who had been a prisoner and was released by us, moved to the States, and he was in Fort Lauderdale as a doctor. He got his degree after he got back home, became a doctor, and he spoke about his experiences at Dachau. Another interesting thing is, since my book is out, I had a call from Washington, not D.C., the state of Washington. A fella was a prisoner of Dachau when he was 4 years old. He and his sister and mother and father somehow lived, but they were getting ready to be killed. They were prepared for it when the word came that the Americans were coming. And so he remembered the day that the soldiers came with a little rainbow on their shoulder. And he remembered that day, and he called me to say thanks for reminding the people of what happened.
One of the things that's really interesting to me is that I collect postcards. And if you look at Dachau and you kind of squint your eyes, there's very little difference between the Dachau of 1913, the Dachau of 1970s, and then the contemporaneous postcard of today. But one thing is for sure, the concentration camp has changed dramatically. And as Chuck mentioned, there's only one barracks that's left, and everything else has been razed. Now, this particular view, you're looking from north to south, which is the opposite of the map I showed earlier. But you can see that the whole place has been basically now created into a museum and a monument to the tens of thousands of people who perished in the camp. So the town hasn't really changed physically. The concentration camp certainly has. And Chuck Palmeri changed a great deal, because here we see a photo of Chuck as a young and eager Beaver recruit, a replacement. And here's Chuck post-Dachau in his nearly year, actually a little bit more year-long service in Europe after the war was over. And you can see the physical changes between before and after. So Chuck, we are in my hometown church. We are all, probably most of us anyway, are people of faith. And I think many of us must have this question on our mind.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
Because when I was in Dachau, I saw all these bodies. And I knew these families had been praying to be saved. And they obviously weren't. And so I began to create a doubt in my own mind about faith at that time. But then I thought it through, and I thought, maybe we weren't there quick enough to save all these that are dead. But we were there in time to save the 8 or 1,000 there and others that came afterwards. So our prayers did help. And other than that, I want to say that there are 3 or 4 occasions in my life, in my frontline duties, that were very frightening. And when the day was over, I always said, Grandma, you were praying for me again. And I really believe that prayers, and I have tremendous faith, even after what I saw there, because we saved another 1 million people that he would have killed if we hadn't come.
Because you're a very active practicing Catholic, you're a member of the Knights of Columbus and very active in that organization. So however you became reconciled to this evil of man, you certainly have not parted ways with God. And I think that's if you can still be a man of faith having seen what you've seen, it's a really powerful testimony.
I will never understand the people who followed orders and killed. This all started with Hitler and his group, and yet they had millions of people on their side. I saw pictures of our soldiers as prisoners of the Germans being walked through the city, and the people spitting at them. So when these people say, so many times we heard the comment, me no Nazi. I wasn't a Nazi. I wasn't responsible. But they weren't responsible, but they put up with it.
So let's talk a little bit about the book, because this must have been a challenging project to undertake. And how long did it really take you of concerted effort to get the manuscript to me? Was it months, years? Was it a while?
Well, I don't know. I think it's like I crossed the thing from my mind, because I went on to came back home, went to college, and got married and had children, and was successful in business, and I was so concerned with that I forgot I think I wanted to forget what I saw. Yes, I wanted to forget it. And I didn't talk about it again, never talked to anybody about it. I had old soldier friends from Orchard Park, where I'm from. And they never talked to me about their service time, and I didn't talk to them about mine. I didn't talk to them about the Dachau concentration camp. And it's I don't know what to say.
So you started to write things down?
Pardon?
And when you started to write things down, did that trigger memories as you began to put your thoughts together on paper?
Oh, well, my young sister, that I said was 23 years younger, wanted me to write her biography, and then she wanted me to include more. She brought me a little black book with all vacant pages and said, "You better start writing this." And she pestered me about it. And I started writing this back when I was in Orchard Park in Buffalo, before I came here. But really, I have to say, more than any other person, my sister is responsible for my starting to think about writing a book, and then automatically got into Dachau.
And I'd also like to add that Carol Palmeri, Chuck's wife, has been absolutely here the whole time. It was like a team. There were the three of us. And frankly, I think I have to give Carol Palmeri credit for bringing the book to fruition, because she did a lot of the heavy lifting as the book was being prepared. So good job with Carol, absolutely.
Let me tell you, we almost got divorced 3 times while I was writing this book. And we might still, because
Oh gosh, no, that's not going to happen. No, I'm sure that won't.
she did a marvelous job.
She really did.
And you did too.
Well, thank
You
you.
helped me, wonderful.
It was.
She's a great editor. If you're going to write a book, this is the girl to go to.
Well, it was absolute privilege.
And she studied the situation and read all these books, so she knows more about the concentration camps than I do. And I was there.
I know. I know.
You can tell listening to her.
Well, I'm actually planning to write a book about Dachau, because there are a number of anomalies in the story that I'd like to really put down and really kind of investigate and bring to life. And so I've been collecting, and I have this huge library, 400 or 500 items. And it's really funny, because I've gotten to the point where if something pops up on eBay, some photos, I can actually email the seller and say, "Hey, I know you're advertising this as a photo of Dachau, but I really don't think that it is, because," and then I can start to enumerate why, in my opinion, this is not an actual photo of the Dachau concentration camp. And I have to admit that I have bought some photos of the bodies. And when I get them, I do not open the envelope. I just mark what it is, because I know the seller, I'm anticipating the photos. I mark what it is, and I've put it away, because frankly, I do not want it in my mind, because when I was very heavily researching Chuck's book, I started to have nightmares. And this was just secondhand. So to imagine what it must have been like to actually physically see the reality and smell what had happened there must have just psychically been quite an accomplishment to put it in the back of your mind. Now, the last time we got together, Chuck and I have done a variation of this program twice. And of course, before COVID, we did a program at Selby, and then we did an amazing program at the Gulfgate Library. And it was packed. If you've ever been to Gulfgate, there's a partition. We had to take the partition down. We had chairs all over the place. It was standing room only. People were actually turned away because there was discussion about the fire marshal coming down to count heads. And I remember very vividly that when you were talking, we could hear, if there had not been carpet in the room, we could have heard the proverbial pin drop as people were absorbing what you said. But between then and now, the book cover has changed. And tell us a little bit about winning the gold medal. So Chuck won the gold medal in the most hotly contested category, the Florida Authors and Publishers Association contest in 2020, the autobiography and memoir category. So Chuck, tell us a little bit about what you thought when you heard from me that you'd won the gold medal.
I didn't believe it.
Okay.
I didn't believe it. Because I didn't think the book was that good. But I read it myself often. I reread it, and I remember things. And since I've written the book and I read it, I remember other things that I can now include in book number 2.
Okay. Well, we're up for it. We can do an
I don't
abridged
think so.
version. Okay, we'll do a second volume or another edition. Absolutely.
I want to tell you, I just want one more thing about faith. And that is, when we were advancing to the city of Schweinfurt in Germany, our regiment had to go around the city. So we started about 6 o'clock at night, and we walked completely around the north side of the city, all overnight for 15, 16 hours walking. And it was raining and cold, and we had to hang on to the guy ahead of us to stay awake. And every once in a while, we would pull over and for a 10-minute or a 5-minute rest. And one time I sat down, and all of a sudden I sensed something was over here. And I looked, there was a dead German soldier right there next to me. And I thought, that was really scary. But what I wanted to tell you is, when we got to our position around the backside of Schweinfurt, and we were there to prevent the Germans from escaping, coming out, or maybe we would go in from the north side. And suddenly I saw in front of me, not further away than this fellow with his mask, a machine gun pointed right at me, down in a machine gun hold. There was an officer and 2 men sitting there. And they saw me way before I saw them. And why didn't they shoot me? They surrendered on the spot. So I thank my grandmother again for my prayers. There was firing going on in Schweinfurt. There was no reason why these guys didn't shoot me, except they thought, this is the end. We've killed enough. And that was one of the several times. And that was the day that I got a Luger pistol, which I still own. I got it from the officer, and I still have it. We took pictures of it, and I showed it to several people. But a lot of things happen like that. I have a very good friend who was on the front lines for like 3 days. And he was standing on top of a little hill next to another fellow. And finally he said, well, I'm going back into my foxhole. So he walked away, and as he walked away, he heard an incoming artillery. You can hear him coming. And it hit close by and killed the man he was just talking to. And he was never the same. To see this fellow torn apart, and he was never the same. Never went back into battle. They took him back to the hospital, and he was, and when Tony just died last year, and when Tony would talk about it, even now, tears would come to his eyes. War was devastating on people that lived. As I said to you, at Dachau, in the end, my real concern was for the guys that were still alive. That how are they going to, and some of them did come back, like the little 4-year-old, and the Dr. Fisher from Fort Lauderdale. And several hundred died
Every day.
a day. after we got to Dachau. That's it.
So, when we gave our program at Gulfgate, you remember that I surprised you. I try not to surprise my authors, but sometimes I do. And at the very, very end, I surprised you with a question. And it's very dicey when you surprise someone because you don't know what they're going to say. But at the very end, I asked you one question, and I held my breath because I had no clue what you're going to say. Do you remember what I said, if you could say one thing to our audience, what would it be? Do you remember what you said? I'll never forget.
I believe what I said was, we have to talk about these things and introduce them. I want the book because I want the people to read this and know that it happened. Because I hear officials saying it was exaggerated. It never happened, which is what I said once. But it happened. And one of the reasons I wanted the book to be read is I want you and everyone else to know that it did happen, that these people were so immune to decency and terrible.
Well,
But that's why I'm here.
I would like to thank
But I see
everyone.
people nodding here, they know about it.
I think our audience is that we're a group of believers. So I would like to thank everyone for being here tonight. I would like to thank the Church of the Redeemer for hosting this event. Jim, thank you so much. Father Strom, thank you so much. Chuck, thank you for your service. Thank you for writing your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.